April 7th, 1982. A few minutes before 7 in the evening, the hallway on the fourth floor of 1847 16th Street Northwest smelled of old carpet, cooking oil, and something else. Hot electronics. It seeped out from under the door of apartment 4F in a faint metallic breath that did not belong in a residential building. Under fluorescent light, a dozen faces hovered in the narrow corridor. Librarians and lawyers, an engineer, a 72-year-old widow gripping her purse, and the superintendent holding a master key that suddenly felt heavier than it had any right to be. The door in front of them was painted a tired white, its edges nicked where decades of furniture had scraped by. There was nothing remarkable about it. No sign, no name. On paper, it belonged to a quiet tenant called David Thorne. Behind it, over the past weeks, they had charted something that did not fit ordinary life. Power consumption far beyond any neighbor. Strange noises in the small hours. Radio interference. Men who came and went, but never stayed the night. They had argued, doubted themselves, phoned the FBI, been told to stand down. Now, with the building's master key between his fingers and a hallway full of people watching, Superintendent Frank Delgado realized the smallest tremor in his hand was visible to everyone. If this was nothing, they were trespassers, hysterical, perhaps criminals. If they were right, they were about to walk into the middle of the Cold War. The ridged metal of the key slid into the lock. Somewhere, a television in another apartment hummed through the wall. A phone receiver in 4B, left off the hook on purpose, kept a line open for whoever might have to call the authorities when this was over. In the stairwell, the faint echo of the city, sirens, buses, a distant car horn, sounded oddly far away. Frank turned the key and pushed the door. The smell of hot electronics hit them like a physical thing. Washington, early 1982, sat in one of those paradoxical moments only superpowers seem able to generate. On one hand, the economy heaved under interest rates, unemployment, and a president promising to rebuild military strength. On the other, an invisible war hissed through the cables, antennas, and telephone lines. It had been just over a year since Ronald Reagan had taken office and begun to speak of the Soviet Union in language that sounded more like a crusade than a détente. The official relationship had hardened. There were boycotts, sanctions, talk of deploying new missiles in Europe, public arguments, and private games. The capital mirrored that tension. Whole neighborhoods lived in the penumbra of classified work. Government analysts, code clerks, translators, technical staff, and mid-rank officials came home to the same kind of apartment buildings as everyone else. They walked their dogs, hauled groceries up stairwells, and picked up their phones in the evenings without thinking much about who might be listening on the line. For foreign intelligence services, this was the real treasure. Embassy personnel and declared diplomats were known quantities. Every major service understood that men and women with certain license plates and certain job titles were watched by the FBI and CIA. The more valuable targets were the thousands of people below the camera line, the analyst who brought draft reports home, the technical contractor who complained about work over the phone, the wife who repeated in fragments what her husband could not say directly. By 1982, the KGB had refined a solution. Instead of relying only on risky physical meetings outside the protective bubble of embassies and consulates, they built technical posts. safe houses designed not for sleeping, but for listening. Apartments buried in normal buildings, equipped like Radio Shacks and recording studios, that could quietly vacuum the airwaves and telephone wires around them. On the books, they looked like any other rental property. In practice, they were extensions of the Soviet residentura, the clandestine backbone of Moscow's presence in Washington. The FBI was not blind to this evolution. Inside the bureau, counterintelligence squads tracked suspected Soviet officers, monitored suspicious rentals, and ran their own listening posts in a mirrored game. But the scale of the city's daily noise and the limits of manpower meant tips were triaged and filed. Leads sat in inboxes longer than anyone liked to admit. That gap between what the system knew and what it could act on ran straight through the center of the 6-story brick building at 1847 16th Street. The building had gone up in 1957, when the city still believed in mid-century optimism and the idea that middle-class apartments could be anonymous and safe at the same time. It stood on a stretch of 16th Street, where embassies and row houses blurred into one another, close enough to downtown that a bus ride could get you to the State Department or Library of Congress in under half an hour, far enough that rent stayed within reach of civil servants. 36 units, stacked 6 high and 6 across, with a narrow lobby, a bank of mailboxes, and an elevator that groaned in protest at every floor. It was, on most days, unremarkable. 4th-floor resident Margaret Chen would have agreed with that, at least until the winter of 1982. In the files of the Library of Congress, she was a research librarian, the kind who could find footnotes buried in obscure journals and trace the origin of a policy memo from a half-remembered quote. In the building manager's log, she had been a tenant in apartment 4B for 3 years, always paid on time, rarely complained, occasionally left notes about flickering hallway lights. Her daily routine had the quiet precision of someone used to dealing with references and deadlines. She left for work at the same time each morning, returned with a canvas bag full of groceries and paperbacks, and usually turned in early. Her friends would have said she had a habit of paying attention to details other people missed. A change in the color of a door, an unfamiliar odor in the hallway, the way someone carried their mail. Directly beneath her, in 3F, lived Robert Harrison, a mid-level analyst who worked in a Soviet affairs unit at the State Department. On paper, his job was to scan cables, transcripts, and intercepts, then reduce them into something a deputy assistant secretary could understand in 10 minutes. In reality, it trained him to see patterns where most people saw noise. The rest of the cast in the building was, statistically speaking, mundane. There was Thomas and Ellen Bradley on the 5th floor, 2 lawyers whose home was piled with casebooks and whose idea of rebellion was arguing about constitutional clauses over dinner. There was Michael Chen, Margaret's younger brother, an electronics engineer contracting for a defense firm in Northern Virginia. On the 2nd floor, 72-year-old widow Dorothy Patterson kept a tidy 1-bedroom and a habit of writing things down, shopping lists, appointments, and, when the story began, something stranger. Up on 5, photographer Carl Winters rented a small unit whose closet overflowed with cameras and lenses. On a side corridor, Janet Kowalski ran her television at higher volume than her neighbors liked, but made up for it by baking cookies for the building at Christmas. At the center of their shared life was Superintendent Frank Delgado, who knew every pipe and cable that coursed through the building. The master keyring hanging from his belt could open every door. The meter room in the basement was his private kingdom, full of spinning dials that told him, without ever meeting them, which tenants left lights on too long or ran space heaters all winter. They moved past one another in hallways, nodded in elevators, exchanged small favors. Their lives intersected in ways so minor that no one could have predicted they would soon form a kind of improvised intelligence cell. The only truly anonymous figure in the logbooks was the man attached to apartment 4F. He appeared as a line in the superintendent's rental ledger. Thorne, David, 6-month lease, paid in cash, no parking space, no pets. The application listed an employer with a bland name and an out-of-state address, the sort of front company that only looks suspicious in hindsight. He did not complain about anything, did not request maintenance, and did not appear at tenant meetings. Packages occasionally appeared at his door and vanished before anyone saw who took them in. There was nothing about him, at first, to distinguish him from the thousands of single men who rented apartments in Washington, worked in undefined jobs, and kept their lives to themselves. If there was a design to this anonymity, it worked. Until the morning Margaret's instincts told her something was wrong. On February 13th, 1982, a Saturday, the hallway on the 4th floor was quieter than weekdays. The city outside staggered under a late winter chill. Sometime after 9, Margaret stepped out of 4B with a bag of laundry on her hip and started toward the stairwell. Halfway there, she noticed that the door to 4F was ajar, not wide, just a sliver, the latch not fully caught, the lock not engaged. Enough to leave a black line of space between painted wood and frame. The first thing that struck her was the smell. Under the usual cocktail of detergent and cooking fumes lurked a sharper, metallic odor, like the air at the back of a TV repair shop. Hot insulation. Dust on circuit boards. A tang she could not immediately name, but recognized as electrical in a way ordinary appliances did not produce. Margaret had been inside enough apartments to know how they normally felt. Behind most doors on this floor, the air smelled of fabric softener, cooking oil, or burnt coffee. Here, the fault line between hallway and interior might as well have been between domestic life and a machine room. She hesitated, then did what any cautious neighbor might do. She leaned just far enough to see. Through the crack, she glimpsed a narrow strip of interior, a section of wall painted off-white, the corner of a kitchen counter, and, strangest of all, a thick orange cable snaking along the baseboard toward the bedroom. It was not the thin cord of a lamp or radio. It looked industrial, almost out of place among the bland fittings of a furnished apartment and the sound, faint but present, of some device running just beyond the range of understanding. A low, continuous mechanical hum. For a second, she hesitated. Then, with the instinct of someone who understood both the boundaries of privacy and their exceptions, she reached out and nudged the door with her fingertips. It didn't move. The latch had engaged more than it appeared. The gap was fixed. Two things settled in her mind as she turned away. The first was that apartment 4F did not contain any of the noises of human life. No radio, no television, no footstep, no water running. Only the hum and the smell. The second was that, across the hall in her own unit, the walls had been speaking to her for weeks, and she had not listened. Almost every night, sometime between 11 and 3 in the morning, she had found herself waking to a faint, patterned noise. Not quite voices, not quite white noise. Something mechanical. Something that started and stopped at intervals long enough to be noticed if you were the kind of person who noticed such things. Back then, she had chalked it up to the building's old lungs, the boiler, the elevator, the settling of pipes. Now, with the smell still clinging to her clothes, that explanation felt insufficient. By noon, she had told 2 people. Her brother Michael listened with the focus of an engineer and immediately started asking technical questions. What pitch was the hum? How thick was the cable? Was the smell sharp or oily? Robert, informed later that day, went somewhere else entirely. His mind mapped what she had described onto things he had read in internal reports. Off-site listening posts, clandestine antennas run through plaster walls, safe apartments evacuated in a hurry. He did not say KGB out loud, but the acronym hung at the edges of their thoughts. The building itself had been whispering to them for weeks. They only realized, too late, that they had been hearing the same story from different angles. Janet had noticed first that her television reception went strange on certain evenings. Blank bars banding across the local channel just after 10, then clearing as if someone had flipped a hidden switch. Frank had watched the meter in the basement for 4F spin at a rate that suggested a small factory rather than a studio apartment. Carl had begun to photograph the comings and goings at the front door for a photo series on urban anonymity and discovered 3 different men using the key to 4F, none of whom looked like the blurry driver's license photo he had glimpsed once in the building's file. Alone, each detail could be dismissed. Together, laid out on a kitchen table under a yellowing overhead light, they formed something that looked disturbingly like a pattern. The first call to the FBI came 4 days after Margaret's glimpse through the door. It was Robert who placed it, from his office, using the language of someone who understood that certain words triggered certain reactions. He identified himself, gave his clearance, and carefully spelled out what he and his neighbors had observed. Anomalous power usage, irregular visitor patterns, unfamiliar men entering and exiting. Equipment noises consistent with radio or recording devices. Phone interference, and the use of a front company in the lease. He did not say, "We think this is a KGB Safehouse." He said instead that the behavior matched what internal training materials described as a foreign technical operation. The agent who took the information logged it, asked a few questions, and promised the matter would be referred to the appropriate squad. Robert hung up with the faint, uneasy satisfaction of a citizen who had done his duty. For the next week, nothing visible happened. No unmarked sedans appeared. No technicians came to test the walls. No one from the bureau called back to ask follow-up questions or schedule interviews. The building continued its normal rhythm. People went to work and returned. Someone's child cried in the stairwell. Groceries were hauled up. A trash bag tore on a step. Inside the walls, the hum continued. On 2 nights, Margaret woke to what clearly sounded like tape reels turning somewhere in the bones of the structure. Michael, encouraged by his own paranoia and his sister's story, brought home a portable spectrum analyzer, a gray box with a screen and knobs, and spent one evening in Janet's living room, carefully sweeping through radio frequencies with the television volume turned down to a whisper. They found spikes, narrow, regular bursts, sitting on bands reserved for government use. Not continuous broadcasts like amateur radio chatter, but short, precise pulses as if someone were capturing and forwarding information. It was at that point that the group stopped being a collection of concerned neighbors and became, accidentally, a clandestine committee. They met in the Bradleys' apartment because it had the biggest table. Dorothy brought her notebook. Carl brought photographic prints of the men he had seen using the 4F key. Frank brought copies of utility records folded into his jacket. Janet brought gossip, descriptions of unknown cars parked across the street, their occupants sitting too still to be waiting for anyone. They did what all groups under stress do. They started to write things down. Dates, times, license plates, names if they had them, descriptions if they did not. The color of coats, the brands of cigarettes, every interference spike Michael recorded. Every night, Margaret heard the reels. Robert used his training for the country's service against the country's own bureaucratic sluggishness. He created a chart, columns and rows mapping behaviors to known indicators from counterintelligence manuals. At the end, with the kind of fatalism that comes from looking at too much classified material, he added up the marks on each side and saw what he had expected. If this case had walked into a training course, it would have been used as an example of what to look for. He called the bureau again. This time, the agent on the other end was polite, perhaps slightly impatient. The information had been passed on, he was told. An assessment was underway. The caller should not, under any circumstances, interfere with any ongoing federal investigation. It was the first clue that someone, somewhere, had at least taken notice. It did not answer the question that sat in the pit of everyone's stomach. If this was dangerous, why was nothing being done to stop it? The turning point came with a phone call that was never meant to be traced. On April 6th, just after lunch, Dorothy answered her ringing phone on the second floor with the slow, habitual motion of someone for whom the device remained a marvel. She said her name. The man on the other end did not. The voice had the flattened vowels of someone whose English had been learned in formal classrooms, not at a kitchen table. It was neither thick enough to be caricature nor light enough to be unnoticeable. He told her, in careful phrases, that older people should not concern themselves with matters they did not understand. He referenced, without being specific, conversations in the hallway and curiosity about other tenants. He remarked that accidents could happen, that the city was unpredictable, that crime rates were not what they had been. He never raised his tone. He never used the word threat. By the time the line went dead, Dorothy's hand shook so badly she could barely put the receiver back in its cradle. She did what she had always done with things that frightened or confused her. She wrote it down. The phrases she could remember, the cadence, even her guess at the man's age. When she showed the page to the group that evening, the unease they had all been carrying hardened into something more like resolve. There was no way for a stranger to know which of the building's 72-year-old widows had been sitting in a hallway on a particular night, taking notes, unless that stranger, or someone close to him, had been watching them in return. If the apartment across the hall had been listening outward, it had now turned inward. The following day, They took a vote. 14 people, including those who had rarely been involved until then, gathered in the Bradleys' living room. They spoke, one after another, about the risks of doing nothing and the risks of acting. Some feared legal consequences. Others feared simply waking up one night to the sound of boots outside their door and realizing that they had lived next to something lethal and ignored it. Frank sat quietly until the end. When he finally spoke, it was simply to point out that he was in a unique position. His master key could open 4F without breaking anything. If they entered and discovered they were wrong, he would take responsibility, call it a welfare check. If they were right, they could bring photographic and physical evidence to the FBI that could not be waved away. 8 voted to go in, 6 voted to wait. The majority, as it often does in such stories, did not guarantee safety, only direction. They agreed on a time, early evening, when the building would be noisy with returning tenants, but before the late-night activities in 4F usually peaked. The plan was almost laughably simple. Frank would open the door. Margaret and Robert would document what they saw with notebooks and a borrowed camera. Then they would withdraw. No one would touch anything more than necessary. They would then go, together, to the bureau. Out of some half-formed hope that the system would intervene if given one last chance, Robert placed another call to the FBI that afternoon. This time, the call was routed upward. He was asked to hold. When a voice returned to the line, it introduced itself as Special Agent Mitchell from a counterintelligence squad. Mitchell asked Robert to summarize, one more time, what he believed was happening in his building. The analyst did so, adding now the phone threat to Dorothy and their own improvised surveillance. There was a pause at the other end. Then, for the first time, someone from the federal government acknowledged what had previously only lived in the uneasy space between suspicion and knowledge. Mitchell told him, in slow, measured words, that the Bureau was aware of potential hostile intelligence activity in the general area. He told him that certain operations could be jeopardized by civilian interference. He told him, in the formal language of liability, that if any private citizen forcibly entered a residence they did not own, they would assume legal responsibility for the consequences. It was not a direct order. It felt like one. Robert hung up with a sick, divided sensation. The organization he worked alongside from a distance was finally admitting that his fears were not fantasies, and at the same time was making it plain that the only acceptable role for him and for everyone else in that building was passive observance. In the hallway, outside 4F, Frank fiddled with his keys. From behind the thin door came the sound of movement, a dragging noise, like something heavy being shifted. Faint voices, too muffled to make out individual words, but distinct enough that even those who did not understand Russian could recognize it for what it was, a language they heard only on news broadcasts about foreign capitals and missile tests. For Margaret, the sound drove home a simple truth. Whatever was on the other side of the door was not a forgotten storage unit. When Frank looked back, he did not see a neat chain of command or strategic considerations. He saw Dorothy's pale face as she read from her notebook, the way Janet's hands had fluttered when describing the car across the street, and his own fear that if they waited for permits and internal memos, the hum and the smell would simply evaporate one day, leaving nothing but an empty room and unanswered questions. The key turned. They stepped into a space that felt less like a home than a stage set meant to convince a casual observer that someone, somewhere, lived there. The living room held the minimum expected furniture: a couch, a coffee table, a lamp. No photos, no personal clutter. No books stacked half-read on side tables. No ashtray with a familiar pattern of cigarette butts. The cushions on the couch looked as though they had never borne the imprint of a body. The noise Margaret had heard for weeks resolved itself as soon as the door opened fully. It was not one sound, but a layered composition. The low whir of cooling fans, the mild rumble of transformers, the soft mechanical click of tape machinery in motion. The smell came from the back. They moved through the living room as a group, nervous not to leave anyone alone. Margaret, struck by a disorienting sense of déjà vu, recognized patches of the room from her glimpse through the cracked door: the stretch of wall, the edge of the counter, the orange cable now clearly visible where it hugged the baseboard. It led them to the bedroom. The bed, if it had ever been assembled, was gone. In its place stood metal racks from floor to nearly ceiling, filled with equipment: radio receivers with frequency dials and analog meters, multi-channel recorders, amplifiers, and black boxes whose front panels bristled with switches and jacks. A reel-to-reel tape machine fed a loop through its heads, turning slowly. The tape itself worn slightly at the edges from repeated passes. Oscilloscopes glowed with green traces. Indicator lights blinked. A small clock, set to Washington time, ticked quietly on a shelf next to another set, labeled in Russian, with a city none of them could read. Cables ran everywhere, along the walls, across the ceiling, through drilled holes toward the outside. Thin, almost invisible antenna wires traced along the curtain rods and disappeared into cracks around the window frame. What Margaret had taken for an extension cord was part of a power distribution system designed to support far more load than any domestic apartment required. On the floor, near one rack, a stack of audio cassettes sat neatly labeled. Some bore English numbers written in a precise hand. Others carried titles in Cyrillic script. Michael, drawn by the irresistible force of professional curiosity, leaned toward the nearest panel and took in the manufacturer's marks and specifications. This was no hobbyist setup cobbled together from off-the-shelf parts. It was integrated, purpose-built, expensive. On a small table against one wall, an open notebook revealed more Cyrillic, columns of figures, and frequency bands. Next to it, a device that looked at first glance like an ordinary telephone switch box sprouted lines that led both back into the building's own wiring and out toward the maze of radio equipment. They understood, at least in outline, what they were seeing. This was a listening station. One part of the space had been devoted to the illusion of occupancy. Speakers lay hidden behind vents and under floorboards, looping the sounds of domestic life. Footsteps, drawers opening and closing, a chair scraping, a toilet flush, a cough, all compiled onto a tape that ran in the living room when no one was present. What the neighbors had taken for intermittent noises of a night owl tenant was a recorded soundscape designed to fool them. The real work, the real life of the apartment, existed in the back rooms. Robert pulled his attention away from the implications long enough to remember why they had come. He began to describe everything, out loud, for someone to write down: model numbers, layouts, the existence of Russian language documentation. Carl's shutter clicked in the thick air, capturing the racks, the cable runs, the notebook pages. In the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed with an absurdity that struck Margaret as almost cruel. There was milk, eggs, a few containers of food, as if someone had halfway committed to the fiction that human beings lived and ate here. They found no passports, no personal letters, no clothing beyond a few shirts hung in the closet. Whatever men had used this apartment had not intended to be easily traced if they had to leave. They stayed perhaps 10 minutes. It felt like a lifetime. When they stepped back into the hallway, pulling the door closed behind them, there was a sensation, at least for some, of having crossed an invisible line. They were no longer people with Sicilians. They were witnesses to a covert installation in the heart of their home. Within 18 hours, they would understand that in the bureaucratic logic of national security, crossing that line came with a cost. The FBI did not invite them to a briefing. They were told to come in separately, at different times, to a field office on Pennsylvania Avenue. The building's gray facade and metal detectors looked just like every other federal complex in the city. For most of the tenants, it was their first time passing through security into the belly of the apparatus they had only known from newspapers and films. The interview rooms were not dramatic. No one was shackled to a table. There were no one-way mirrors, only blinds that might as well have been. Yet the tone, from the first question, made it clear that this was not a debriefing of helpful citizens after a heroic act. It was, instead, an assessment. Who had initiated the break-in? Who had copied the keys? Who had touched what? Had anyone removed any items? Did any of them have contact with foreign nationals, foreign students, foreign organizations? How much did they know, exactly, about radio equipment? About federal jurisdiction, about the penalties for interfering with lawful investigations. The questions, especially when turned on Robert, took on an edge that felt less like curiosity and more like the testing of a hypothesis that this entire episode could itself be a mask, a cover story for something else. They were being treated, at least in part, as suspects. Only gradually, through the oblique angles of those questions, did they perceive the outline of what had been happening around them. The Bureau had indeed been aware of Soviet activity linked to that area. The apartment they had entered was tied, in the opaque language of internal memoranda, to an ongoing counterintelligence case. Surveillance teams had been watching the building in ways the tenants had not recognized as surveillance. Technical units had been, in their own time, mapping emissions and tracing telephone connections from the outside. The plan, as far as anyone in those interview rooms could piece together from what the agents did not say directly, had been to let the operation run long enough to trace not just the equipment, but the people, the officers who came and went, the couriers who carried tapes and notes, the cutouts who laundered rent and supplies. An arrest at the wrong moment, a search too soon, could have cut off more valuable lines of inquiry. Instead, the existence of a room full of civilians with photographs and first-hand accounts had forced the Bureau's hand. Within hours of the neighbor's entry, federal agents had used their own keys and warrants to open 4F officially. The equipment had been photographed again, this time with government cameras. Devices had been dismantled and carried out under tarps. The refrigerator had been emptied, its contents logged. Any remaining paper, any note, any fragment of code or schedule had been boxed. Somewhere in those same hours, someone in the Soviet apparatus had been alerted. Perhaps they had lost contact with the station unexpectedly. Perhaps someone watching from a parked car had seen unfamiliar men carrying racks down the stairs. However it happened, within days, the faces the neighbors had captured on film no longer appeared at the building. The listening post was gone. The FBI, forced into a reactive posture, closed the site and shifted to trying to salvage what remained of the larger network from the wreckage. To the men and women who had lived next to the safe house, the narrative they received reduced to a blunt message. Yes, they had been right. Yes, they had walked into the middle of a KGB technical operation. No, they should not have done what they did. On paper, no charges were filed. No one went to jail. Frank kept his job. The tenants returned to their apartments. The legal system, which might have crushed them under charges of unlawful entry, vandalism, or interference with federal operations, showed restraint. But in the quiet aftermath, gratitude was absent. In its place was a lingering sense that, in the logic of national security, they had committed an offense more serious than trespass. They had disrupted the choreography, injected unsanctioned human judgment into a space carefully managed by professionals. They had refused, when told indirectly to wait, to be quiet. The aftershocks of that refusal rippled through the building over the next 3 years in ways that never made it into any official file. Margaret lasted 6 months. For a while, she tried to reclaim normalcy. She went back to her days of shelving books and chasing references. She tried to walk the hallway past 4F, as if nothing extraordinary had ever happened there. The apartment had been thoroughly sanitized. The government had removed every trace of cables and equipment. Painters had come under the neutral guise of routine maintenance to patch over the drill holes and repaint the walls. The door received a fresh coat of white. A new name appeared in the ledger. A young couple moved in carrying a mattress between them, laughing as they navigated the tight turn at the stairwell. They hung posters. They turned a key in the same lock. At night, in 4B, Margaret heard ordinary sounds again. Arguments over trivialities. A television set to late-night movies. The rhythm of footsteps that belonged to people, not tape loops. And yet, every creak in the wall sounded to her like a ghost. Every hum from the wiring carried an echo. She could not look at the newly painted door without seeing, layered beneath the color, the racks of equipment and the taped domestic noises. She moved out in the fall, citing a desire to be closer to work. The superintendent's log, which had one day recorded, in the same blunt handwriting, the arrival of Thorne David, cash 6 months, added another line, Chen M, vacated, deposit returned. Others followed slowly. For some, the reason was financial, or so they told themselves. Rents in other parts of the city were cheaper. Commutes could be shorter. But beneath those explanations lay something harder to name. An unwillingness to live in a building where, for a time, the walls had listened and the state, foreign and domestic, had treated your home as a chessboard. The community that had once gathered in the Bradleys' living room dissolved under the pressures of relocation and time. There was no dramatic breakup scene, no collective decision to stop seeing one another. People simply stopped knocking on doors as often. New tenants who had not sat around a table drawing arrows between names and frequencies arrived with no knowledge of what had transpired. Janet's television interference disappeared when the wires inside the walls were rerouted. Dorothy kept her notes, but the pages describing the threatening phone call were folded more often than the rest, the creases deepening each time she opened them to remind herself that it had been real. Years later, if asked, she would say that the worst part had not been the man's veiled menace. It had been the realization, sitting in the FBI interview room, that the government that claimed to protect her had regarded her actions as a variable to control, not as courage. The building itself endured. The bricks did not remember. The hallways filled with new noises, new arguments, new secrets. 4F became just another address on a rental listing, its past compressed into a few sentences on a classified document stored somewhere deep in a federal archive under a case number no tenant would ever see. Somewhere else, in another system of archives, in a colder city, there was likely a matching file, a notation that a technical listening post in Washington had been compromised in April 1982 due to local interference, that the operation had been terminated, that personnel had been reassigned. Those reports would tell the story in terms of equipment lost, opportunities missed, risks mitigated. They would not mention Margaret's unease at the smell in the hallway, or Dorothy's trembling hand, or Frank's sense that his simple duty to the safety of his tenants had collided head-on with an abstract, distant war. From the perspective of strategy, historians might one day argue that little was changed by what happened in that fourth-floor apartment. The KGB continued to run operations. The FBI continued to chase them. The Cold War marched toward its own endings and implosions, shaped by leaders and economies and movements that had little to do with a single safe house on 16th Street. But at the human scale, the level at which most people live their entire lives, the incident exposed something the official narratives rarely dwell on. Systems built to wage quiet wars depend on the compliance of those who live inside their battlefield. They need neighbors who do not ask why a door is always closed, employees who believe that if something truly dangerous were happening, someone in authority would surely act. They require citizens to accept that the complex work of security is best left to institutions and experts, that the role of the ordinary person is to vote, pay taxes, and look away. In 1847 16th Street, for a brief span of weeks, that unwritten contract broke. A librarian, an analyst, a superintendent, a widow, a photographer, a lawyer, a television-watching neighbor, and an engineer decided that the evidence of their own senses counted for something. They wrote, watched, compared notes. They disobeyed a gently phrased warning and opened a door they had been told, implicitly, to leave shut. They were not saints. They were not trained operatives. They were frightened, inconsistent, sometimes reckless. In their haste, they ruined an operation that might have revealed more. They cost their own side something real in exchange for satisfying a very human need to know, here and now, what was happening to them. The state's reaction, on both sides of the invisible line, was telling. To the KGB, they were an unpredictable variable, a reason to pack up equipment and burn identities. To the FBI, they were a complication, an uncontrolled input into carefully laid plans. No one, in any official capacity, told them that what they had done was right. For the people who had to continue living with themselves long after case files were closed, that silence became its own kind of judgment. Decades later, someone new walks down that fourth-floor hallway. They pass a door that looks like every other door. They may pause only to check the number, balancing a box on one hip, keys between their teeth, mind already on furniture arrangements and where to put the television. They do not know that they are crossing the space where antennas once followed the wires behind their walls, where their future neighbors once sat in another apartment with a spectrum analyzer and fear, where a reel of taped domestic sounds spun on in the dark to mimic a life that did not exist. They do not know that, for a short time in 1982, ordinary people living one paycheck away from ordinary problems found themselves standing in a narrow hallway, facing a plain white door, and chose to ask a dangerous question. Who, exactly, gets to decide what happens inside my building? The price of that question was paid not in executions or show trials, as in more brutal regimes, but in subtler currencies. Distrust, relocation, a lingering ache whenever a phone call goes quiet in the wrong way. In the end, the story of the Safehouse is not only about a foreign intelligence service tapping American communications. It is about the tension between two kinds of silence. The silence that authoritarian systems enforce with fear, and the silence that democratic systems, differently powerful, request from their citizens in the name of strategy and patience. Between those two, the people at 1847 16th Street discovered that trust, between neighbors and institutions, between what you see and what you are told, may be the most fragile, covert operation of all.